jump in. What are your questions about part 3? What are your ideas you want to talk about?
I was wondering why Sonya is kind of so nervous when she gets to Raskolnikov's apartment.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions about Sonya? Okay. Other questions?
The significance of the tradesman dream.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of about Sonya actually, but the similarities between Sonya and Dunya,
Mm-hmm.
and how they're both kind of selling themselves in different ways.
Mm-hmm.
I thought Raskolnikov was a lot less guilty, and when he got pardoned at the end of part 2, I think that really stuck with him, and he doesn't feel as bad anymore. He doesn't feel compelled to confess, and it's a lot more about survival for him. I think he's a lot more worried when people find out. He's a lot less daring to be come and get me, I guess. He sort of wants to live free.
Yeah, he's feeling pretty good. I think during part 3, maybe more so than part 2.
Yeah.
It continues to kind of vacillate a good deal.
Yeah, I was wondering about his really drastic mood changes when he goes from being a nicer person to not nice at all and just becomes really angry.
And even, did you write about his a repulsion towards his family? Even somebody did maybe. Did you? Okay. Yeah, I mean, when certain kind of entities enter near him, he has this kind of reaction that he can't quite control. So yeah, let's consider that. A lot of you wrote something about the article. A lot of you did. So what are you coming in thinking about or wondering about?
I just felt like it was kind of really unexpected, and it was just very convenient for the plot line, or just for Porphyry. But so I thought it was definitely helpful for the Superman theme. I thought, because it's that's what it was about.
Yeah, well, there are intimations about this kind of Übermensch theory, Superman theory, right from the beginning of the novel. It isn't only at this point where it's kind of overtly addressed. So we'll talk about that. Anything else?
Why he wrote the article.
Why?
Or what? You read it 6 months ago? Is that what it said?
Yeah.
That was
Published in months.
the crime was 6 months ago too.
No, the crime hasn't been that long.
So he wrote it before he committed the crime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And which started Porphyry's interest in Raskolnikov, and he didn't know Raskolnikov, he just had come across this article. But things start to line up for Porphyry. You would imagine Zamyatov has talked to Porphyry. Porphyry has prior knowledge of this article. Then we come to find out during the course of that conversation that the Leona, the pawnbroker, had pretty detailed notes about whose stuff she had, who she promised what to whom. So therefore, when she's killed, the police have all this stuff and they know who it belongs to. And slowly people have come, or maybe not so slowly, to get that stuff. And the last name is Raskolnikov's, that he hasn't shown up yet until now. So Porphyry's got that, this conversation with Zamyatov, and knowing that Raskolnikov wrote this article on kind of being superior, or that some people could be superior. I guess in the article it doesn't necessarily, he is, and that's part of that conversation. Porphyry really asks him, do you think you could be? What happens if the wrong person assumes they are? So it's a slightly different conversation, can this exist ever? It's one conversation. A different question is, what if we get mixed up in this, thinking we are a Superman, but we're not? And we can always kind of talk about the murders as that, the plural, that the first one kind of fulfilled his philosophical reasoning and rationale, and the second one never did. It's the second one that bothers him. Late in in part 3, Raskolnikov's very bothered by Lizaveta's murder in particular. He ends up calling out for help in that moment. What does he call out to, or what does he call out for? Anyone remember? He just starts kind of yelling Sonya's name. He calls out for Sonya. She's not there.
He says he like wonders why they don't weep, Lizaveta and Sonya, and he compares them, right? He says, it's in that same part, right? He's talking about Sonya.
Yeah. Later on, he takes particular interest of Sonya in, and I think I've already talked about this, in how she can kind of psychologically cope with being a prostitute. Because he sees them both as transgressors, but he sees himself as not being able to kind of cope or deal with that internally, and he sees her as being kind of unaffected by what she does. And for those reasons, at least, and others, he's kind of interested in kind of finding out her secret, more or less, for selfish reasons, so how he can figure it out for himself. Did you find that, Joey?
Yeah, I found the quote. So he goes, strange though, why is it that I almost never think of her as if I hadn't killed her? Lizaveta, Sonya, poor meek ones with meek eyes, dear ones, why don't they weep? And it sort of goes on, like, why don't they moan? They give everything.
Yeah.
And their eyes are meek and gentle. Sonya, gentle.
They both seem giving of themselves. There's some description of Lizaveta before just being very giving, kind of being dominated in some way by Aliona. And we certainly know more about Sonya and how selfless she really is. Great, so let's jump into some of these things. The thing that got me rethinking about the comparing Meursault and Raskolnikov was on page 226. That's one of the first quotes on these notes. It says, Raskolnikov says, I remember everything down to the smallest detail, but try asking me, there's a typo there, me why I did this or went there or said that, I'd have a hard time explaining. So again, like Meursault, really unsure of like motivations and rationale for things. At times, he's not a reliable character, so at times he thinks like this. And at these moments, I would compare him to Meursault. And also Meursault talks about the power of memory and remembering just so many details. It comes to some of those revelations in jail as he kind of remembers. The article, let's just talk about that a little bit more. Some of this we already talked about. So Raskolnikov wrote it. He tried to publish it. He did, and we come to find out that he didn't really know that it was published. But Porfiry certainly found it somehow and read it and took interest in it. So that kind of catches Raskolnikov by surprise. It's a quiz question. What's the trap Porfiry tries to put out for Raskolnikov during the course of their conversation?
He asked if Raskolnikov saw the two painters, but they were there on the day of the murder, not
Yeah.
2 days before.
Right.
Raskolnikov said he was there.
Great. And for a moment, he almost says yes. And he recognizes that trap that's been put out and then kind of moves around it. But it is about the painters again. Painters who aren't there 2 days earlier. Raskolnikov says he was there. So the tradesman we talked briefly about before the quiz, but I come to understand it as just part of Raskolnikov's psyche, the part of him that is paranoid that other people know. In the story, he's not a figment of Raskolnikov's imagination. He's a person on the street that Raskolnikov tracks down and then calls him murderer. But as well, I think as Raskolnikov probably feels about himself and his deeds during part 3, this is a part that comes near the end of this section and certainly segues into kind of these mood changes again, where he doesn't feel great about what he did or why he did it. Sometimes consciously, and sometimes I don't think consciously, not at this point. And that is just kind of manifested in his physical sickness, in these mood changes, and and I think the tradesman kind of, in some way, kind of represents that. It also triggers this kind of dream. If he's not feeling good about himself or what he's done, this dream kind of epitomizes that. It's hard, again, to know that it is a dream until you get to the end and you get the part that he woke up, and you kind of have to look back and say, okay, what did he wake up from? And that last paragraph is like 2 pages, and then that's the dream. What's the dream, plot-wise? Like, what's happening?
So he's the tradesman. The tradesman waves to him, and he follows him back to Aliona's apartment, and she's just sort of like hiding in a corner, and he starts hitting her in the head with an axe over and over again.
Yeah. What does she do?
Wow.
She laughs.
People watching too, right?
What's that?
People
Yeah,
watching.
the door's open. And people are outside watching. Which kind of stems from, like, did the tradesman really see Raskolnikov go into that apartment? Does he really know that he's the murderer somehow? And I think now, probably subconsciously, really questioning how many other people could really know this. Again, he's off the heels of having that conversation with Porfiry too, and this starts this kind of cat and mouse game between Porfiry and Raskolnikov. For the last thing that is of interest to Porfiry is to put Raskolnikov in handcuffs and say, we have the evidence to convict you, and we're gonna do it. That's not what Porfiry's interested in. Porfiry's interested in what? Do you think, from what you know of him? How does Porfiry assume Raskolnikov will eventually be caught?
Through his own undoing.
Yeah, through his own undoing. There's a quote up there. It comes from later in the novel. Did I read that to you guys the other day? It's with the moth and the candle. Have you ever watched a moth near a candle? A candle flame, Porfiry says. Well, that's the way he'll be with me, hovering, circling around me like a moth at a lighted candle. He'll lose his taste for freedom. He'll start to think, get tangled in his thoughts, ensnare himself around as though in some net or other, worry himself to death. Porfiry's probably absolutely convinced of this premise, that somehow Raskolnikov is going to be ultimately attracted to give himself up. And it might come at his own expense of his own health and kind of mental state, but at some point, to work himself down so far and so desperate to unburden himself by saying, I did it. And as we kind of explore that later on in the novel, we'll also have to explore, what does it mean to say, I did it? Is that just a selfish act so you don't feel bad about bearing this guilt anymore? How is it different than kind of really understanding and believing with every fiber of your being that you did do something wrong, rather than just admit to something you don't want to deal with the guilt anymore? What does it mean in a spiritual sense to repent? So he kind of works through those, just as we've talked about stepping over and all the different ways, kind of criminally, morally, spiritually, he stepped over to begin with. And those are kind of explored later on when he tries to kind of come to terms with what he's done. Let's talk about Sonia for a little while. How do they interact in part 3?
Shows up at his house on behalf of Katerina.
Yep. To do what?
Invite him to the service dinner.
Both the funeral for Marmeladov and the dinner. She does talk about Katerina really wanted this dinner, so they're going to do it. The dinner is an interesting kind of moment in the story that's coming up a little bit later. But this is the first time Sonia kind of seeks out Raskolnikov and it really interacts with him. She is nervous. as much as she, is a prostitute on one hand, there is a kind of innocence about her and nervousness. I think particularly around a force like Raskolnikov that has, it kind of embodies evil, I think, in different ways at different times. So I would attribute that as these, like, she's not really sure kind of what to take him for. And there's that connection to Dunya too, that they're similar in probably their age-ish, similar in that they benefit from relationships with men, but men are certainly taking advantage of both of them as well. At least that's how Raskolnikov sees Dunya's relationship with Luzhin. And Luzhin, what was that quiz question? About trying to isolate Raskolnikov? That was the extra one. How does...
He says that if Raskolnikov is there when he comes that evening, then he'll leave.
Yeah, he's like requested this meeting with the family. Presumably to discuss how rude Raskolnikov was to him when Luzhin came to visit earlier in the story. But what does Dunya conclude about that meeting in part 3?
She wants to judge Luzhin's reaction to Raskolnikov, so she wants him to be there.
Yeah, so she's asked Raskolnikov and Razumikin to join them.
Just in terms of the plot, though, he doesn't end up going because he goes back to his apartment and sleeps. Raskolnikov, right?
No, they haven't gone yet.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're gonna go in part 4. There's some discussion in some of your notes. You didn't say it out loud, but just going around the room and looking at what the questions or ideas you wrote down. Some of you wrote down narration or what was kind of Razumikin's role, or why is he's pretty drunk for a while here. And it is one of the very few times in the text where that limited third-person narration that's kind of followed Raskolnikov leaves him. And we follow Razumikin. So on this first page of your notes, it says narration. I said, what's the artistic function of having so much narration focused around an inebriated Razumikin? When he's chatty, right? I mean, he does like Dunya. I mean, he's drunk. He says things that he kind of regrets the next morning. How does that function in the novel?
I feel like it's going to become a conflict because, well, there's already illusion for Dunya, and then if he likes her, but also
It could give them an option. It could give, Pulcheria is worried about marrying her off or something. And Raskolnikov really wishes she was with somebody else. Yeah, we could kind of do both.
you could. But I was thinking, well, I just thought maybe it might become a conflict because Raskolnikov doesn't want her to be owned by anyone, and so I feel like it might be a conflict between this is my good friend, but also I don't want Dunya to be owned by somebody and be someone else's property.
What do we get just by having a break in being near Raskolnikov? Anything gained by that? Yeah.
I mean, in terms of like how his mental stability, between before that break and then afterwards, he seems a lot more together.
Mm-hmm.
He's able to function a bit better, and a break kind of shows the transition there, but pulling us away from him.
Connor, you had your hand up earlier.
Yeah, I was just thinking it's also kind of like a way for, like, Razumikin kind of serves as everyone's communicator. Like, it allows Dostoevsky to kind of leave Raskolnikov in this state of, like, not wanting to talk and kind of being in and out of delirium, but still being able to kind of convey the story of the novel. And it's not like Pulcheria or Dunya are big talkers either, so Razumikin kind of just keeps everything going along. And it's like also in the novel is kind of the segue between Raskolnikov and his family. Like he does a lot of the talking for either side.
And I agree with Connor. He said, and if you see Razumikin as a foil to Raskolnikov, it's like sort of everything that he, in the beginning when he's reading the letter and he's like, oh, I love my family, I have to act for them. Like it's sort of what he wishes he could do, but he's in this state right now where he can't. And Razumikin is sort of like taking over that role. It's what Raskolnikov like, sort of would be doing if he was in his.
Yeah, the point about being a foil is interesting. The next morning when Razumikin wakes up, there's some narration about how bad he feels about how he acted and what he said and how he wish he could take some of it back. But he's pretty, I mean, his name, right, stands for reasonable. He's pretty rational. He has good intrapersonal skills and like kind of a ability to dialogue with himself. And that is really kind of the opposite of Raskolnikov, who's high about what he's done and why he's done it one moment and then, passing out for 4 days because he can't deal with it in some way. Let's move on to some of these other topics with 10 minutes or so left. Suffering continues to be important in the novel. People are kind of drawn to suffering, particularly Raskolnikov. His eyes being described as a strong feeling to the point of suffering shown in his eyes, but at the same time there was in them something fixed, even if mad. Talking about mad and madness, but also suffering. And then we have this bizarre story we get about a fiance that he took. And he's attracted to this terminally ill woman who was the landlady's daughter. And you just kind of wonder why. And this idea that he's attracted to maybe her own suffering as much as to suffer alongside her is something to consider. And then just talking about feeling tortured a lot. Here's a quote I think about when his family is there. Instead of joy at his family's arrival, something like a heavy, concealed determination to endure an hour or two of torture that could no longer be avoided. But that role, I mean, we've talked about suffering's role in Russian Orthodox Christianity. And if you see that word, I mean, it's just something to pay attention to as we move on. Let's talk about Marfa for a second and then segue into Svidrigailov. And then I want to talk about those forces at play clearly by the end of this part, which are really important. So there's one major dream at the end of this part, which is the one we talked about with Raskolnikov, the landlady and the tradesman. But there is a little bit of a dream referenced early on. We don't see the dream necessarily, but Pulcheria talks about dreaming and seeing Marfa dressed all in white. Interesting enough, Dunya talks about premonitions that Pulcheria often has, and they kind of joke about it a little bit. But this other thing about, we can't say she's clairvoyant and sees the future, but she does seem to be connected with her own subconscious and thinking about things, much in the way that this story gives us Raskolnikov, and we see him suffer because of his subconscious. Sometimes become aware of things, sometimes not aware of things, and we see kind of a series of dreams that will continue. Who's Marfa? Just to make that clear.
Mrs. Svidrigailov.
Mrs. Svidrigailov, great. And what has happened to her?
She died.
She died. What were the circumstances?
She had a stroke.
Yeah. Where?
Apparently.
Apparently had a stroke, yeah. We get more information later on that seems like a pretty convenient story, and most of the blame seems to be put on Svidrigailov in terms of murdering her. So, if she's dead, then we get Mr. Svidrigailov, single and available. And we know he's like Dunya. We know Dunya's in St. Petersburg. And he has shown up. And we talked about it earlier. He's the man who follows Sonya to her kind of while she goes back to her apartment, and we don't know at that moment that it's him. And then he enters at the very end of part 3. But it is that at that moment that these, I don't know, sometimes I say 3 forces, sometimes I say 2. It's kind of like 2.5. So I put in front of you the story of the story of Job, or the book of Job from the Old Testament. That's just a summary, just so you can kind of understand the story a little quicker. It's something I would like you to read before Friday, our next conversation about crime and punishment. But the general gist of the story of Job is like this quintessential story, and old, from the Old Testament, that of what happens when good and evil kind of battle over a soul. And it is, one of the earliest stories that we can kind of reference, and so much of this novel is that. So if we have our soul, our kind of blank slate here, we've got Raskolnikov, kind of that slate. He's not necessarily evil, he's not necessarily good, and sometimes he kind of feels one or the other. I mean, when he's giving all the money he has to the Marmeladovs so they can have a funeral and kind of a proper dinner for Semyon, he's kind of good. Certainly when he kills, he's not. But I think he's the one that's being battled over. So we get these kind of forces kind of at play of just evil and good kind of battling for him. It's kind of quintessentially kind of religious story. So who's our good force? Primary. Well, it's kind of hard to see her as a primary force at this point.
Sonya.
Yeah, it's going to be Sonya. And that's ironic in and of itself. It's like, how's the prostitute the good one here? And that's part of what we need to uncover. And that's what Raskolnikov doesn't really understand about her, too. He sees both things and he doesn't understand them. There are some other characters that kind of can go in this as well. We've got Razumikin, we've got Dunya, and Mom Pulcheria. And then they're all relatively good forces on Raskolnikov, but it is certainly Sonya that is going to be the most important going forward. And right next door to Svidrigailov, literally in the novel. So we've got Svidrigailov as the evil one. Who else might go in that category?
Losing?
Yeah, probably Illusion as well, but certainly to a lesser extent. And now we've got this other force. I don't even know how to draw this. Present in the novel, and it's kind of pushing on Raskolnikov to choose something, to choose this or to choose this. And well, who is it?
Is it Portrait?
Yeah. And it really is this looming presence, kind of looking over Raskolnikov's shoulder, and the choice between killing himself or confessing has come up before, and that those options for him will continue to come up. In and of itself, just that to stay in the middle, to just try to hide this or deal with it on your own is not a possibility. Svidrigailov will tell him later, you can either put a bullet in your brain or you can confess. And, I think we have to kind of look at those options as obviously kind of one being kind of evil and self-centered, and one as being kind of good, or at least, making some amends to come to terms with really kind of a full kind of repentance, refuting of what you've done, and kind of an acceptance of what's right in the world, of kind of in a religious sense, and being born again, to kind of refute of the previous lifestyle and really kind of devote yourself wholly to a new belief. So this is pretty important, just to wrap our heads around as we kind of go forward in the story. Let's see what else is on this sheet. So the other biblical story I gave you with this, so you have the story of Job is a summary, and then you have the full text of it. There's so many different versions of text of the story of Lazarus. So you're going to get some weird derivations of words. Because it's kind of like King James Bible excerpt, I believe. But nonetheless, this is a story from the New Testament. The story of Lazarus came up overtly with Porphyry, in Porphyry's house, where Porphyry asked Raskolnikov, do you know Lazarus? Do you believe in the story of Lazarus? Lazarus is kind of the quintessential story about the power of belief in God. So Porphyry would want to know, Raskolnikov, do you believe in Superman theory? Do you think you're a Superman? And another way to kind of ask that is, do you believe in the power of God? Like, or do you think you get to make all the rules, or do you subscribe by the rules more or less that are created by God? So the story of Lazarus is important, and in this moment, but it also comes up 2 or 3 more times. Raskolnikov actually is intrigued by this at some point and asks Sonia to read this story to him. Some parts of this she actually reads to him, and it's relatively short, so you can just understand, who Lazarus was, kind of what he gets out of this story, what kind of Jesus does in this story. And again, this is kind of like one of the last miracles, Jesus is said to have conducted before he's executed. And one of the reasons he's executed or crucified is because he did this, because he rose somebody from the dead, and that kind of freaked people out, as the stories go. But at the same time, this guy rises from the dead because he believed in a higher power. He believed in something bigger than himself. So it's good to at least familiarize yourself with this story. I think that's it for now.